Okay. So hello everyone, I'm Teresa, and together with Maria, Aaliya, Joanna, and Hendrick, we are going to present to all of you sustainable development and this section of the different needs of our society. So social needs, environmental needs, and economical needs. First of all, we need to understand the term sustainability. Sustainability focuses on meeting the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations, the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And we see this as an intersection of social needs, environmental needs, and economical needs. This could be described as a Venn diagram, according to Cato's model of sustainability. The idea is to foster social and economic development while ensuring environmental protection for future generations. This is due to the fact that resources in the world are finite, and there is a need for caution and care of them. The concept also stresses the need for elimination of poverty, for the alteration of consumption patterns, as well as protect natural environments and the resources in the process of economic and social development. In this presentation, we'll focus on the importance of preservation of the environment as a need for development. Okay, so first of all, we need to understand the theory of environmentalism, which is a political and ethical movement that seeks to improve and protect the quality of the natural environment that surrounds us through changes in the already existing environmentally harmful human activities. It advocates the preservation, the restoration and/or improvement of the natural environment and critical earth systems, like, for example, climate, which is something that has been really affected in the past centuries. It denotes a social movement as well that seeks to influence the political processes that by, for example, lobbying, activism, or education in order to protect our ecosystems. For example, an environmentalist is a person who speaks out about our natural environment and the sustainable management of it. So basically through changes of public policy as well as individual behavior. When we focus on environmental development, there are some geographical factors that can affect it. This can be location, coastlines, natural resources, climate, and weather. Now we're going to look at the three more important ones. So, for example, coastlines is a very important factor, given that it improves transportation links, industrial and urban development. It's a big revenue for tourism, as well as food production, which can develop on economic growth, which can also influence the social needs. For example, Mexico, with the Gulf of Mexico, which has plenty of oil and gas resources, this can mean a very important economic growth for the country, since it facilitates export and import. But coastlines can be also can have also bad influence on a country, like, for example, Indonesia. One of its biodiversity wise most richest island, which is called Java, has lost its 78% of its natural barrier due to rising sea levels and the sinking of the land, which affects not only the climate but also the people living there. Then climate, pleasant and mild temperatures benefit the quality of life of the people living in the region, as well as the economic activities. For example, the Mediterranean region, with very warm weather and stable weather, supports a dense population as well as huge agricultural activity. But for example, there's regions in the world that have been more affected by the changes in the climate that human activity produces. Like, for example, Afghanistan, between 1950 and 2010, there has been an increase of 1.8 degrees of temperature, which can also cause severe drought and food insecurity and problems in water sanitation, which also affects the lives of the people living in Afghanistan. Finally, in natural resources, it's very important as well for economic growth, since its extraction is a source of economic growth of the country, since it increases the income and it also increases the opportunity of jobs. But it can also be harmful, given that the exploitation of these natural resources for the economic growth of the country can all affect the biodiversity of the country and the social needs. For example, in Malaysia, the exploitation of palm oil, which is a very important resource in the food production globally, has made an impact on the country, since it has lost nearly a fifth of its old growth forest since 2001. as well as the exploitation of the people working in the industries. So now that we have seen that there is a clear intersection between social needs, economical needs, and environmental needs through these case studies, we can see that there's three types of sustainability: economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, and social sustainability. And we need to understand that these are not the most important ones, but this is also very important for the development of a country. But we need to understand what social sustainability means. Yeah, so it's basically a process for creating sustainable, successful places that promote well-being. By understanding what people need in the places they live and they work. For example, this can mean promoting infrastructure to support social life and cultural life as well, social amenities, systems for citizen engagement, in which the citizens have the power to in the decision making of the decisions that surround environmental needs and economic needs. But sometimes in our societies, there are lacks on social justice, and the strategies that we need to promote for this social sustainability goal are improved healthcare, improved education, ending corruption, addressing poverty, empowerment of women, and the emphasis on social justice. Now we're going to focus on a very large majority of our populations, which are women, and sometimes are disregarded from the decision-making that promotes social sustainability. So basically, women, this belongs to the goal 5 in the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's very important because due to the lack of representation of women in the decision-making processes that promote social sustainability, they suffer the consequences the most in food insecurity, water sanitation, education, healthcare, etc., in the countries that are more affected by climate change and other type of factors that affect development. So it's really important that women have the facilities in our societies to enter this type of discussions. So yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Teresa. Now that we've defined terms such as environmentalism and sustainability, we're going to look at the impact that climate change has directly on development. And in order to understand that, I think we need to look at a word that is often associated with both development and climate change. It's called climate injustice. And to look at it, we need to understand who exactly impacts the environment, right? Who produces carbon emissions and who gets hurt by it. So for that, if we think of 1 ton of carbon dioxide as 1 grain of rice, and we think of this world as a bowl of rice, a person from Nigeria adds 1 grain per year. A person from India adds 2 grains. From China, 7 grains, Germany, 10 grains, America, 17 grains. So we go by that logic. An American per year pollutes 20%, like 20 times more than an average Nigerian does. Why am I mentioning this? Why is this important? You guys tell me, why do you think it's important to what extent which country contributes to climate change? Why do you think it's important that we look at historical emissions? Arham.
To hold them accountable now.
Exactly. And also going back to what Arham said yesterday about the example of Bangladesh and them trying to meet the net zero emissions target, is that Bangladesh is a third world country. It's a developing country. Why we need to take into account historical emissions and how much which country is impacted is that we're not just looking at, this is just the contribution of 1 person per year, but what we're trying to look at is how much of these carbon emissions have piled up over the years. And there was a UN report, I think, that calculated it, that since 1850, we now have 1,500 gigatons of carbon dioxide in the environment. And that's the thing with carbon, it piles up over time. It doesn't go anywhere. That is why we need to look at the historical factor of which country has contributed how much. Next slide. Something I also want to talk about is, next slide, is capitalism and how that ties into who contributes how much, because the richest 1% in the world contribute equally in terms of emissions as the poorest 50%, which is a huge margin. I thought this would be a good case study because everybody might know about it with Taylor Swift and her emissions because of her private jet, because I think recently it came out that her emissions are 1,700 times more than that of an average human being just because of her flights. Yeah, and this is just a case study that I thought would be good to talk about it. But what I want to talk about is basically how millionaires and billionaires, and because of capitalism, people who are in power, they contribute so much more than people who aren't as economically advantaged. And this isn't just a problem that's limited to countries, that's limited to like, oh, USA contributing more than Bhutan. It's also impacted on inequalities within these like lower income countries. And I think there was an Oxfam report a few years ago, which basically had this like, it's called a dinosaur graph, which talks about income inequality in the world. And it talks about how if we calculate emissions based off of income and how they're impacted, we still see the same pattern, is that the rich contribute immensely more to the climate change crisis than the poor people, even within countries such as Bangladesh or India or China or Brazil, like countries that are known to contribute more like highly to the climate crisis. Even within these countries, there's poor people and there's people in the lower stratas of society that don't contribute that much, but the country overall still does. So that disparity still exists within these countries, which is obviously impacted directly by capitalism. Okay, moving on. No. Next. Yes, my first case study is of Jakarta, which is a city that is currently sinking. And I hope that, like, as global students, a lot of us are aware that this isn't the only city that is sinking in the world. There's cities, again, Bangladesh that is sinking. There's China, there's parts of Shanghai, there's parts of Tokyo, there's Maldives, there's Bangkok, there's parts of Kolkata, New Orleans. So this is a problem that's prevalent all around the world. And for Jakarta specifically, this is the Waladuna Mosque in Jakarta, which is now underwater. It doesn't exist. And the last time anybody prayed in that mosque was in 2001. And basically in Jakarta, more than 10 million residents are at risk. The entire northern part of Jakarta, which is in contact with the Java Sea, is completely gone. And what we need to understand, again, is the impact of climate change on development, but how it significantly impacts like small fishermen communities, for example. In Jakarta, those are the only people that are suffering. They're completely displaced. Every year, Jakarta goes down by 25 centimeters inland, which is it's really big. It's a really big impact on the lives of these fishermen that live on the coast. This is how they get their income, which again shows how states don't necessarily care about, like, they care about economic goals, they care about financial goals. They have realistic values, even if it, like, as a country, they're suffering. What they're trying to do to mitigate this is they're shifting their entire capital. They're building a new capital on a new island. Again, the problem is that island belongs to indigenous communities, and 20% of Jakarta's population is indigenous communities, and they're going to get displaced because of it, which again goes to show the impact that development and the impact that climate change significantly has on development, and more focused on development of poorer communities and communities that don't have the means to support themselves. Going back up to the case study of India, I think India is a very very basic, but like very clear example of how climate change that is caused by countries that are more powerful affects people that have no like role in contributing to it whatsoever. This is a very sad example as well, because in India, many people are known, people are known for dying because of heat waves. There's many people that have died. It's a very big issue. It's also a big issue for farmers that, directly depend on agriculture and farming for their livelihood. And then there was another case study. There was another report that said that every year India's economy suffers by 2.5 to 5% of the GDP because of just climate change and its effects on development and its effects on the agricultural sector. And then another example of this could be heat waves in Africa, which are caused by like other factors that aren't their own fault, but then they have to pay the price for it, which again, realism, capitalism, and the effects of climate change on development. What I would like to end with is that of course, what we need to like realize while we're thinking of these case studies and while we're thinking of the overall overarching impact of climate change on development is that we need to treat it as like a more not rich poor country issue, but also more of like a rich poor issue period. And we need to look at wealth taxes, and we need to look at holding people accountable and holding obviously countries accountable. But then I think the main way to do this is implementation policies, and is to question whether or not they really make any difference, because there's been many climate change policies such as the Kyoto Protocol or even the Paris Agreement, which is very clear that people aren't meeting those goals and these countries aren't being held accountable for their contribution. So making policies and making climate mitigation carbon emission mitigation policies that are legally binding, that actually make a change and that actually make a difference. I think that's one of the ways to kind of combat this. And also persuasion, because if we're being realistic, we live in a capitalistic world. No country is going to do anything unless it directly impacts them or unless they're doing something good for themselves. So we need to think of like incentivizing ways in which richer countries do what's arguably good for the world, but might not be good for them financially. Yeah, that's my part. Patrick?
Yeah, it works, right? Okay, so I'm going to be talking about environmental conferences, but before we go on with this topic, I would like to establish what exactly environmental conferences are. Environmental conferences are basically massive events in which different representatives of different countries gather together in order to discuss about certain climate change actions they would like to proceed with. In these events, there are also most of these nations also try to report on the current protocols and treaties, or even propose new treaties and protocols that they would like to share with other nations. Some of which include COP26, which is the environmental conferences, and one of the protocols would be the Kyoto Protocol. First, first of all, I would like to say what the UN Convention on Climate Change is. Oh, thank you so much, Monica. The UN Convention on Climate Change is a document that sets the legal framework that will be used for countries to tackle climate change. This legal framework is a relatively new concept, and it basically establishes the principles that legally each of these treaties or proposals should follow, some of which actually include the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol is basically a protocol that was implemented within this CCC framework in 1977, in which it committed, industrialized countries and economically developed countries to reduce their carbon emissions by 5%. However, one of the big drawbacks this Kyoto Protocol had is that it only directly impacted developed countries, and therefore left on the side all of the other underdeveloped or developed countries. I'm sorry. The Kyoto Protocol did this only because it recognized the fact that developed countries or industrialized economies were highly responsible for the current climate change crisis because of their high CO2 emissions. And then we'll come back to this one. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Paris Climate Agreement. This was an agreement stated in COP21, which was in 2015. And basically, the whole point of this agreement was to also include developing countries as well as underdeveloped countries. One of the big strengths of this climate agreement was that it not only held accountable underdeveloped countries, but also developed countries, as it understood that there were many economical differences between states. It's also important to add that the Paris Climate Agreement is legally binding. And what I mean by legally binding is that it is not, because it doesn't have any body of internal enforcement. And therefore, there are no punishments over the states that do not comply with this agreement. The only legally binding part of this agreement is the fact that every country is compelled and obligated to show each of their actions and future development plans on these type of areas, as well as how the country has been doing in its fight to fight climate change. Yeah, so basically, the only binding part of this is also to disclose the nationally determined contributions, which are called NDCs, which is the action plans to cut emissions of each of these countries. Also, it's worth noting that in this climate agreement, 191 countries, I believe, were part of this agreement. Can we go to the... No, to the... Yep, exactly. This brings me to COP26, which was the climate summit in which 137 countries met in order to talk about reforestation laws, carbon emissions, and their NDCs. Yeah, that's no more to say about that. Can we? Okay, there. So now the important part of this: are any of these agreements working? Sadly, most of them are not working because it's not legally binding. Realism in each country is actually the biggest threat to this type of agreements, as every country is trying to strive towards their own economical development instead of these climate goals. However, there are some cases in which countries such as the Scandinavian region countries, in which they have been able to develop this area much more than in other countries because of their economical power. Another example of this, and it's actually a pretty interesting example, is how the country of Ghana is actually one of the countries that is complying with the Paris Agreement the most. Also, something worth noting is that the Paris Agreement actually came in to kind of replace the Kyoto Protocol, because as I mentioned, it involved much more states and analyzed much more the possibilities to attack this problem of each state. One of the many solutions, as you can see, this is a model made by a research that specifies which countries are actually trying to comply with the below 2 degrees Celsius agreement. And the thing is, Gambia is #1 as it has pretty much fulfilled the goal. However, we have critically insufficient countries such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, that are not complying with this at all, and I actually have larger than 2 degrees Celsius temperatures. The thing, and also one of the biggest criticisms with these accords, and especially with the Paris Agreement, is that it was an agreement that was created in 2015, and it is foreseen that in the next 15 years, we're pretty much gonna have to have a higher number that we would need to reduce. Therefore, it can be said that the problem with the Paris Agreement is that it no longer complies with the modern needs of the world. One of the solutions that they have proposed in order to make these agreements work better is to be more ambitious and ask for even higher levels. Also, people from the University of Yale have actually started an investigation in which they have promoted the idea of creating smaller groups that actually devote and create penalizations for the members of said clubs if they do not fill the required quotas or they do not fill the required agreements in those clubs. Another important fact to know is that, sadly enough, there are a lot of countries that are not seen in this table, and one of them is India, which is actually seen in this table. I'm so sorry, because the problem with India is the fact that they don't really report their improvements, or they do not really report their cutting emission plans, right? And that makes it really difficult to make like a specific table that targets how much a country has actually worked on this problem or not. Another important thing to take into consideration is the case of China, which actually makes up 25% of the world's carbon emissions because of their carbon fuel-based economy, which has actually had a recent improvement as they have cut back on carbon emissions. That's pretty much everything there is to say about climate conferences and protocols.
Okay, so moving on from Hendrick, now we are going to talk about resources. So are resources a curse or a benefit? So from what we have seen until now, resources are really considered to be a great benefit for a country. So if a certain country has certain resources, and if there's a country who does not have resources, so resources, any sort of resources, mineral resources, water resources can really stagger the economic development of a country. But at the same time, it also has a lot of other implications, which are often overlooked at. So with this, I'm trying to attempt to also shed light on the curse as well as the benefits of resources. Okay, so the natural resource curse. So this is actually a phenomena which is known as the natural resource curse. So if you look at a very basic example, we know a lot of countries in the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, which are actually very rich in resources. So there's countries in Middle East which are really good in oil resources. They have petroleum, and as well as in Latin America, they have the Amazon rainforest, for example. It is very rich in certain resources like minerals and like tin, aluminum, and even gold. But despite that, these countries don't have the highest GDPs, or their economic growth is not as much as other countries who actually lack resources. So for example, in this, Iraq is rich in petroleum, which is one of the most important natural gases, as well as the Amazon rainforest of Brazil have several deposits of tin, bauxite, and copper, as well as rare minerals. So the question arises, why are these countries still lagging behind in development? Okay, so the main reasons that comes in this case is of environmentalism as well as capitalism. So beginning with first, environmentalism is what happened in the case of Brazil, that most of the countries which are underdeveloped or in Latin American countries, despite having an abundance of resources, they export most of their resources to Western countries, which are like the US and a lot of the European countries. So 60% of the Amazon rainforest is under Brazil, and the remaining 40, I think, is in other Latin American countries. But all these resources that comes, and most of them, the majority of these resources are exported to these developed countries, which then use it in their favor. So most of the resources are going in the favor of the developed countries instead of for their own use. So that is why it still remains an underdeveloped countries. And in case of capitalism, I think if you look at the example of Iraq, one of the main reasons it's speculated why US invaded Iraq is because of the petroleum resources that they have. And I think it is also very obvious because it was in Iran for almost 2 decades, and and because of that, Iran is still suffering the implications of the war, and their economy suffered a terrible backlash because of the US invasion, and they're still trying to cope up with it and trying to make things better. But it still had a huge impact on their economy, which they can't recover in such a short span of time, while the US still used resources from Iran, and then their economy still boosted likewise. Okay, so that's what was my main point about how there are developed countries, and because of the import and export business, they are the ones who use resources in their favor more than using it in the favor of one's own country, which in turn is a very bad factor for their own economy. But it is also important to know that the benefits of resources are that it does create a lot of employment, and then if a country has resources, and if there's a country who does not have resources, they can really utilize in a way that they can increase their own economy, such as in the example of the US. Like, they have resources and they use it to boost their own economy, and it's one of the most developed countries. But I want to also talk about other countries who don't have a lot of resources. So the question here is, are resources the only contributive factor in economy? So I think, as we have seen and as we have talked, I a lot of people do debate on that how GDP is not a very accurate way of measuring development. And that is because it does not take into consideration other things like sustainable development or human development index. Such as we see that countries like Japan, Switzerland, Belgium, don't have a lot of resources. They lack in very vital resources. Countries like Japan, they have a lot of natural calamities, which is very frequent. Like, they have earthquakes coming, and and they have a lot of negative aspects to them. But at the same time, Japan is like one of the most developed countries in today's world, and it is also known as the country of the future. And that is because they have channelized their resources into something which is important in today's world. So in the case of Japan, they have channelized their resources and utilized it to contribute into things like technology. Say, for example, companies like Sony or even like automobile, the Yamaha, they come from Japan, and these are really like multinational corporations, and these really help boost the economy of Japan. As well as like I was studying about Switzerland and how like Switzerland has a lot of automobile industries and machine industries which they use, because Switzerland is a landlocked country, so it doesn't have any they don't have any coastlines, they don't have any docks and like ships, and it might be looked as a very it might be looked as a big disadvantage for a country, because like Switzerland is, I think, one of the like 2 or 3 countries in Europe which don't have a coastline, but at the same time they use their remaining resources to contribute into things like technology, so which also staggers their development. And as well as they also in Switzerland, they also have a lot of stress, and like they spend a lot of money on human development, which is like healthcare facilities and medical facilities, education, and like that is why, which is very important for like the development of a country, because not only is it increasing the economic development as well as the human development. So like people in Switzerland live a much better life, say, than like people in India, which has an abundance of resources, but at the same time most of the resources are being exported to other countries. So that is why in India, like people are not able to use it in their own favor. So I think that is why resources should not be considered as the only contributing factor for the advantage or even the disadvantage of the development of a country.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about non-state actors' role in this environmental aspect and NGOs. So first, I'm just going to define non-state actors, which are non-state actors include organizations and individuals that are not affiliated with, directed by, or funded through the government. And this includes corporations, private financial institutions, NGOs, paramilitary and armed resistance groups. They work in domestic and international settings, so they both work with like international case studies, but also stuff that happens in their own countries and local areas, and they influence both national and global opinions. So some example of environmental NGOs are Greenpeace, WWF, Friends of the Earth, and a lot more. And something they all have in common is that they're supposed to all be political neutral, so they're not supposed to affect, like, they're not supposed to pick a side when it comes to like politics, but they're supposed to influence all the parties, if that makes sense. And they also all share the same theory, which is environmentalism, which Teresa defined earlier. But there's also some other definitions of environmentalism, such as the theory that the environment has the primary influence on the development of a person or a group. So I'm going to talk about some case studies where NGOs has influenced how states has acted. So the first one is air pollution in Indonesia in 2021. So Greenpeace and then 32 environment campaigners from Jakarta in Indonesia was campaigning for 2 years against the very severe air pollution in Jakarta in Indonesia. And it was a legal challenge against the president and 3 cabinet ministers and the governor of Jakarta and provincial leaders. And then finally, in COP26, they had a breakthrough where Central District Court of Jakarta ordered the president and governor of Jakarta to clean the Jakarta air pollution, ruling that the Indonesian administration had been neglecting protecting citizens. And here you have some pictures of how they were campaigning against it. And it was a big breakthrough for Greenpeace in 2021. And then we have another one, which is the climate lawsuit in Norway, which has been lasting since 2016 till today. So Greenpeace and the Norwegian youth wing of Friends of the Earth, Natur og Ungdom, sued the state due to petroleum exploration in the Barents Sea near the Arctic. they claim that it violates the Constitution, paragraph 112, which is the right to an environment that secures our health and protects our health. They lost the lawsuit every round. They went through 3 rounds and they lost every round. However, it led to the government stopping the exploration because the government then, after like a lot of protests led by Greenpeace and Naturungdom, and the pressure they put on the government, they realized that maybe it wasn't the smartest to do. However, they still have the option to do it since Greenpeace lost all the trials, but they haven't then further taken it to the European human rights chair, where they like it's taken up right now, in hope that it will come up as something that is violating the human rights, which again will violate the Norwegian constitution. However, since the Barents Sea is a very important like place, it's shared by both Norway, Finland, and Russia. It is if Norway takes away all their like exploration from it, Russia can easily come and take over, which is why it's still like a place where the states sometimes are like looking into and be like, oh, should we open for exploration again? Which also shows how still NGOs not necessarily has the most of influence over states due to realism and how power is distributed in the world. Another case study, which is a negative case study, is how is Greenland's criticism of Greenpeace. So in 2010, the current energy found traces of natural gas near Greenland, which then Greenland saw as an opportunity to increase their economical development. Greenpeace did stunts to prevent the oil company from drilling, and therefore prevented also economical development in Greenland. They also, while Greenpeace did the stunts, they also promoted one of their cases to stop eating whales and seals, which the Inuits have eaten for centuries, which again offending their culture. And current energy getting so it led to us that current energy was getting a warmer welcome than Greenpeace in Greenland. So their capitalism and like is more favored than environmentalism due to how Greenpeace has acted in Greenland, and shows how they have done always like take in consideration the culture of countries and how countries like their background and their development are. So in Greenpeace in 2015 actually received fines from Greenland due to drilling rig stunts, which you can see they're doing here, where they come with the Greenpeace boat and then they doing drilling stunts, which prevented drilling and therefore also preventing economical growth in Greenland, which is an important topic for Greenland as they're still under Denmark, which is a country that they also want to be independent from, but they have not been able to do it yet due to lack of economical development. So that's 3 case studies where NGOs has influenced states or not influenced states positively and negatively. So then we're going to go over to the questions. So the first one is, how can sustainable development be achieved? Evaluate the claim that the challenges of sustainability mean that development may no longer be possible.